College Savings Iowa is now iSave 529, and it can do more than take your child to college. It's their passport to a bright future, because funds can be used for K-12 tuition, trade schools, graduate degrees, books, and everything they need to get anywhere they want to go. Register by September 30th at iowa529contest.com for a chance to win a $5,290 contribution. iSave 529, for every child, for any adventure.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 215. I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Paul Zimmerman. Today we continue our talk from episode 213 about data curation in context of the February 2024 issue of Advances in Archaeological Practice. Let's get to it. Welcome to the show, everyone. Paul, how's it going?
It's going great today. It's a beautiful late spring. Well, no, it's not late spring, but it feels like it by the temperature. It's about 80 degrees today. So I spent the day out in the yard doing work. And I'm just bringing that up because I'm going to apologize in advance for all the noise that's going to bleed in. I've got neighbors doing yard work. So there's weed whackers and chainsaws. My daughter's out on the balcony, which is right next to my office here. She's got friends. So I'm sure we're going to hear them. They're drinking mimosas. I'm sure they're going to get louder as the recording goes on. Not mimosas. What am I saying? They're drinking mojitos.
Mojito. I was going to say mimosas. Is it like evening for you?
No. I think that's where they started.
Yeah, exactly. Nice.
Because it's their day off. And so, whatever.
Yeah.
Good for them.
There you go.
But so there's going to be noise coming through. But and then I can't wait to get back out there and finish grilling because it's perfect grilling weather too.
Well, there you go.
How are you?
I'm not doing too bad. We are on our furthest west position this year, pretty much on the Oregon coast, visiting my parents like we do every year. And we're going to head north from here. We're in Florence, Oregon, which is normally it's really nice here when it's hot. Other places, it's nice and cool here, but it's practically winter here still. It's in the 40s, like overnight when we woke up this morning, and it rained a lot of the day today, but it would have these like thunderstorms and then clear up and be sunny. And now it's getting cloudy again. Oh, and I'm just looking out, it's now raining again too. So it's pretty much springtime in Oregon and the Oregon coast, and it's all craziness. But yeah, we're going to be heading up towards Washington State and then making a 6-week journey to, upstate New York. And then we're going to spend the summer in New England. So, yeah. So
the rain in springtime in Oregon, is that different than the rain in summertime in Oregon, or the rain in the fall in Oregon, or the rain, for that matter, in the winter in Oregon?
No, fundamentally, but I think it's just probably more constant and reliable in the springtime the rain is, and it's probably a little bit colder. So, yeah, it definitely depends on where you're at in Oregon, but for sure. Yeah. All right. Yeah. When I grew up in Washington State, I couldn't wait to leave and go somewhere else where it didn't rain. And I'll tell you what, I miss rain. I miss just like a nice long, soaking rain. I mean, it sucks if you got to work outside and do stuff outside. I totally appreciate that. But when you work inside and you just can kind of, grab a nice warm cup of coffee and get some work done with your computer and sit there and just listen to the rain outside, that's not too bad. Of course, you're not like that when you're a teenager. You just want to get out and do stuff. But now I appreciate it. So there you go.
You hear the pitter patter of the rain on the RV roof, and it just lulls you into whatever you're doing. Yeah. Yeah.
It makes your expensive RV sound like a $20,000 tin roof trailer, but that's okay.
Oh, nice.
Especially since most of the rain is falling on solar panels, which have a very different sound than the actual roof of the RV. So it provides a little bit of an insulating effect, actually, now that we're pretty much blanketed in solar panels than normal. Although we don't have a rack yet. That's one of the next things we're probably going to do. There's a number of people in the community that will help you build a rack that basically sits above your air conditioners and everything else and is just literally lined with solar panels. It's a complete cover for your roof and protects your roof actually from sun damage, and probably provides a rain barrier from all the noise too, because it can get pretty noisy in here when it's raining. But that'll be a conversation for another day when we get there, because I love talking about all the tech and electronics in here, which I think is applicable for, or should be applicable for, a lot of like field situations, only because I'm completely shocked that the RVing community has 100% embraced this solar lithium battery inverter lifestyle, whereas archaeologists still like, how am I going to charge my Trimble, on a field project? And I'll never forget being on a project out in central Nevada where we had, computers and GPSs and all kinds of stuff. And we were very remote, and they had a freaking generator out there that we had to sit and listen to run every single evening when we got back. That generator ran long enough to get everything fully charged for the next day. And it was just super annoying. I mean, sure, this was back in like probably 2010, 11 timeframe, and things like Jackeries and other stuff with the big power banks
that you could really out yet.
No, they weren't, and they weren't as efficient, the ones that were out, right? So it would be a different story if I went out today and was in charge of a project like that and had to do some charging. We'd have a much different setup. So
I can guarantee from recent work of mine, what you'd still be fighting around with is everybody. Do you have a backup battery? Do you have a power bank? Everybody's got to have at least a power bank, maybe two in their backpack. Hey, how come all the power banks are back on the table, in the dig office, and none of them are charged? Come on, people, work with me.
Yeah, exactly. They're never charged. That was one of the first big digital archaeology projects I did when I was using tap forms. The big China Lake project I got, it was like 500,000 acres.
Right.
It was 500,000, 50,000 acres. It was still, that's a lot, but I had supplied 30. I know. Yeah. I supplied 30,000 amp Goal Zero power banks to everybody. And I tell you what, because I also supplied iPads to everybody too, to make sure we all had the same equipment and we were all, had the same upgrades and everything like that constantly. And I could download everything and it was just consistent. So that still provided problems. Like I took the iPads every night so we could get them, reset basically, but I let them keep the power banks. And I basically just said, hey, make sure you get this charged. And eventually I had to just start taking those too, because people just would forget to do it. And those iPads, it would just suck down the power. If you were really recording a big site, they would just suck it dry, and you really needed that 30,000 milliamp power bank because that would give you probably 3 or 4 charges on an iPad, but they were also, charging their phone. And then it wasn't, I don't know, it was just enough, I think. But you're right. Trying to keep people to just plug those in when they get home is more of a difficult task than you would think. So, but
yeah, no, I've come to the conclusion that you need kind of an office manager basically that handles that stuff. Make sure everything that has batteries is charged. Make sure that all the walkie-talkies made it back to where they're supposed to be, so that the next morning people aren't fussing around and trying to find things. And, oh no, I left that in the truck. Oh no, it's in my backpack. Let me go find it for you. All that garbage that just wastes time and kind of gets on everybody's nerves over the course of a long project. Yeah,
there's something to be said for those. They're relatively, at least they used to be the last time I looked at it. It's been a while, but those like single charge point power banks where you can drop, say, 10 iPads into it or something like that, and they just slot in and charge, and you plug that one thing in, and they have power bank setups for that too. Of course, you have to buy into that power bank and that set of charging units, but there's something to be said for that, because if you see like a slot missing or something and you're like, okay, whose is this, right? And then that something is not getting charged. I think there's a lot of benefits to something along those lines. This is also making me think of, let's just talk about future tech for a second. Why the hell not? I'm reading the books. I'm reading through audiobooks actually, because we do a lot of driving and I like to listen to podcasts and/or I'm reading audiobooks. It's really challenging, actually. I've got to have it transcribed, and then I'm reading it. We watched the series on Netflix, I want to say, 3 Body Problem, and I'd never heard of the book series before. And if you haven't seen 3 Body Problem, it's actually really good. There's a lot of physics in it, which I really like, but it's based on a series of books written by a Chinese author. And I mean, I'm not going to say anything about the series or the books if you haven't read about it, but basically at some point 200 years in the future, this guy's woken up from hibernation, who came from basically our time period, and he's dealing with what it's like 200 years in the future. And basically, and I was telling my wife this, I saw this like an MIT paper or something like that, like 10 years ago, where they were essentially using something akin to like microwave radiation to basically shoot microwaves across a room to power something remotely, basically, to power something on the other side that could take, like inductive charging, basically, like your toothbrush probably is, something like that, except doing it from a distance, right? Rather than sitting it on a charging base. And the only reason that hasn't really taken off is because it's an incredible amount of loss. It's like 95% loss on power. So what made it so this future society was able to actually do that was the ubiquitousness of power. They basically mastered cold fusion, and they had an unlimited power supply. So they didn't care how much loss there was. They just pumped it out there in massive quantities, and nothing really had a battery anymore. It just constantly had electricity. You know, he was asking this nurse when she gave him a hot cup of something or other. And she's like, "Oh, just adjust the temperature on the bottom." And he's looking at it going, "What the hell is this? Where's the battery?" And she's like, "What's a battery?" And he's like, how do you recharge it? And she's like, "What does it mean recharge?" And he's like, "What happens when it runs out of electricity?" And she's like, laughs. Nobody runs out of electricity. But I was thinking, that's a weird thing to say, right? Because you would still have people like archaeologists doing field work and other people where you're not going to have microwave electricity just like irradiating the whole entire planet, right? It's going to be in enclosed spaces and maybe even cities and streets and things like that. But I can't imagine that would be a foreign concept to even a society that has developed something like that. You're still going to need some sort of internal power supply, even if it's like kinetic energy that's really efficient or something like that, but something that you're charging basically so you can use it. I just can't envision a future where that's not the case. But anyway, I was really thinking about that because I read that part on our drive here yesterday, and it really kind of stuck with me. And it's like, oh, would it really be like that? Would there really be people that don't understand what a battery is? Is that a possibility? I don't know. Anyway,
I don't know. 200 years in the future, I can't think that far in advance.
I know, right? Yeah, it's hard to conceive of. And in the concept of the books too, they haven't really necessarily increased in technology for various reasons. If you've seen the show, you'll know why. But they just improved on existing technologies essentially, and did master a few things like cold fusion. But for the most part, they're not much further along than we are now. They just got really good at the stuff that we're doing now. So anyway, that was a long tangent that took up most of this first segment. So maybe we'll just introduce the show now and then take a break. So
just cue up the topic.
Exactly, basically. So back on episode 213, so 2 episodes ago, we talked about a special issue, a thematic issue of Advances in Archaeological Practice, the February 2024 issue, which we are going to link to again here on the show notes for this podcast. And it was basically about data curation and essentially the data curation crisis. And Paul and I on that show, basically, we talked about a bunch of things, but we didn't quite even get through all of our bullet points. So we wanted to just bring this up again and continue in talking about the project, because on the last one, we talked about some of the big themes of the paper leading around how data is collected and the fact that it's collected in many different ways, depending on where you're at and what agency or organization or company or university or institution you're working for. And then data is stored in exactly the same number of ways, right? There's no real consistency to it, which causes problems for the future, basically. So I don't know, anything to add to the first episode we talked about this on, Paul?
This is, just in case you couldn't tell, 12 minutes into this, it's just going to be a chit chat, right? Yeah. This is a topic that we've touched on briefly before. It comes up repeatedly, and it's always worth revisiting. And neither of us have any good answers. And I think that's one of the problems. I don't know that anybody has good answers, but lots of people have good ideas and good insights. Mm-hmm. And so we just wanted to, continue the conversation that we were having fairly fruitfully a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, with that, let's continue the conversation on the other side of the break. Back in a minute. Welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 215. And now we're going to actually talk about the data curation crisis, again, from the February 2024 issue of Advances in Archaeological Practice. Check out those show notes. And Paul, where do you want to pick this up from what we did last time?
Yeah, so I've been saying that this is an evergreen topic. We need to discuss this. We as a discipline need to discuss this frequently and repeatedly until we start doing things a little differently and a little better. I'm not sure how much I want to say there's a crisis, even though we've got it in the title of the podcast and the previous one as well, but it certainly could be viewed as such. And one of the articles is about a survey that was conducted about different curation practices in different institutions. And why we need to talk about this repeatedly is because one of the points they make is that they compare the results of their survey to a survey that TDAR had done, similar survey that TDAR had done in 2010, and found that despite all the white papers on best practices, all the advances in computer technology, all the advances in storage capacity and such, hardly anything had changed over nearly a decade and a half, which is on the one hand, not surprising at all. And on the other hand, a little shocking and a little saddening. So I just wanted to lead off with that kind of, oh my God, no.
Yeah, that is actually, it is very sad, but it's not very surprising to me because I think I mentioned in the last episode the whole fact that people always seem to want to reinvent the wheel with this kind of stuff, right? It's like, oh, I've got a new project. I'm going to collect data and store it in this way, right? Because somebody new has taken over. Maybe they weren't, I don't know, maybe they weren't trained and they just looked something up and said, do we have any standards? No, I don't see any. Great. I'm going to do it this way, right? Because there doesn't seem to be any like guiding standards, right? I mean, there's a few big organizations that we've already talked about, TDAR, Open Context, things like that, but nobody's really beholden to them, right? Nobody's forced to say, I'm going to, collect data using this standard and store it using this standard. Even if I'm not storing it there, they're still doing it in kind of any way that they want, which is the crux of the problem.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head, and I think that that's probably one of the major takeaways that I've gotten from the articles in this volume is that until people are forced to do things in a certain way, and that's probably going to be tied to grant funding and federal regulations, especially for anything that touches federal money. People are going to do it the way that they think is best. And the way that they think is best might be good. It might not be good, but it's going to be different from project A to project B. And that is one of the problems. I mean, it's a multifaceted issue, related to the skill and the know-how of the various practitioners, but then also related to, you could have two people that know how to do the thing very well, and one of them does it on the East Coast and one does it on the West Coast, and there's no way for these data sets to really be comparable. Or they might even be both in the same region, but one is doing it for one set of purposes and the other is doing it for a different set of purposes, and their data sets aren't comparable. You might think between academic and CRM archaeology.
Yeah, for sure. I think a good example of the mandate sort of that could be handed down is GPSs, right? Like it was as soon as GPSs became just instantly overnight more accurate because of the government lift on the intentional restriction, the intentional error that was put in there. As soon as that happened, I mean, it wasn't very long before federal agencies started requiring sites to be recorded with GPS, and not only GPS, but eventually submeter, right, on certain things. And now it's just ubiquitous, and now it's required. Now, even if it's not required, people still have them, so they still use them on other projects. And I can't think of a project where it probably wouldn't be required. Maybe like a private development project or something like that. They may not have any explicit standards that they're going by, but people are still generally using that because we're just so used to it. We've gotten around it. But that had to be mandated. It had to be required for those federal land projects. Otherwise, nobody would have done it because they were pretty expensive back then, those GPS units. And you're not going to have a bunch of archaeology companies just going and buying a bunch of stuff. It's the same thing with digital recording. That's taken so long to take hold because there's no real standards behind what to use and how to actually do it. But there's no uniform way to do it. There's no, app that everybody uses. There's no, and even if there are a number of different apps, which there are, that you can use to collect data, they all do it in slightly different ways because there's no, again, uniformity, because there's no requirement for uniformity. So I hate to bring in more and more government regulation. I mean, I'm not opposed to or for that in any necessary sense from a political standpoint, but it has to be what it has to be, right? But I think in this sense, you're not going to get any sort of standard until it's mandated, or people just ethically can't see another way to do it. But right. I think we're a ways from that.
Well, you actually, and I hadn't thought about this before in all the kind of half-baked thoughts I've had about this issue and the topics brought up in it. But something you said there kind of just tickled something in the back of my brain, was that it wasn't with the GPS. I've used it on plenty of projects where it's not required. And in those cases, the killer app for using a GPS is convenience.
Right.
Yeah, and that for so many things in our tech lives, it might not be the best thing on a specs sheet that wins out, but it's the most convenient. That most convenient might be the easiest to purchase. It might be the easiest to get installed. It might be that for basic use, it just is easier for most people to use effectively. And GPS is one of those things. People basically get it, and it's basically hard to screw up with. And in the end, you end up with stuff that are, even if you're not using the best GPS and you don't really know what you're doing. You end up with stuff that's basically georeferenced to the world, as opposed to the old days with compasses and plane tables and looking at some printout, quad sheet and trying to get your coordinates off of that.
Yeah.
We're far more accurate with far less work. I'm wondering if, and this is where the tickle in the back of my brain is, I wonder if, a two-pronged approach is actually the right way to go. One being mandates, and then on the other hand, making it just easier to comply with those mandates, easy enough that even if you aren't mandated, you still do it because it's easier than anything else that you would try to do.
I think so, right? I mean, easier often means cheaper too, right? I mean,
it can be, yeah.
It can be, yeah.
It can be measured along a lot of different axes, and expense is definitely one of them,
Yeah, true. So I think you're totally right. If this could be cheaper and easier, then people would just do it, because that usually usually equates to less time spent on something, and that drives the bottom line, right? That always drives the bottom line, especially from a development standpoint in CRM. So, but like we've said, unless it's one of those things, one of the quotes that one of us took out and put in our notes from one of the articles was, "We are conscious that just because digital repositories and guidance on best practices are available, it does not necessarily follow that everyone is using them." And I would say that's absolutely true, that not everyone is using them, because most people probably don't even know those are available, let alone seeking those out and trying to implement on a project to project basis, and or even a company wide basis from a CRM standpoint.
So maybe contrary to what we were just talking about with expense, which I fully agree with, one of the points that was driven home, which I also agree with, so I don't know how to square these two, was that so long as everybody tries to do all these things themselves, I mean, we're a lot of overeducated, hyper-curious people in archaeology, and we do a lot of our work ourselves, and we think we can do all our work ourselves. So one of the points that came out repeatedly was, hiring professionals, trained professionals, and also to get real about the expense of curating your data after you've collected and produced that report or whatever, to bake those costs in, which is going to actually drive up the cost. So again, convenience, like I said, could be measured a bunch of different axes. But if one of the axes is, I can hire, so-and-so, and they can take this data and bash it into shape so that it can go into whatever repository, that is actually, rather than me having to do it, that's a measure of convenience in a way too. Though it might be contradictory to the least expensive way. I mean, expenses too can be measured in a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily have to just be monetary expense. It could also be cognitive load, amount of time that you have in the day to finish these things out, to make your work efficient, and to get those reports back in the hands of whoever's paying for them. Again, I don't have any good answers. Nothing. Not what I've got is a lot of experience and a lot of failed attempts, and I've seen a lot of things that I like and that I want to replicate. But where do we go with it? That's really, for me, that's where the crisis is. The crisis is how to even actually think about this coherently. I know there's a problem with too much data and data that disappear or in other ways become inaccessible, but for me, the crisis is, and thankfully there are other people who are much better versed at this and are thinking about this a lot harder and a lot longer than I have, who are going to solve the problem for me. But I mean, do you see which part of the crisis do you think it is? Is it the crisis that we're potentially losing data, or is it the crisis that we don't even know how to think about not potentially losing the data?
I don't necessarily see those as different things, to be honest with you, because we're definitely losing something, right? Just from some of the examples we've seen of, even maybe if it's not happening as much anymore, but I mean, there's not like a week or two that goes by that I don't see that somebody online has put out their shingle and said, you know what, I've got my master's degree. I'm tired of working for other people. I'm going to start working for myself. And maybe they're just doing cell tower projects, or maybe they're just doing, small survey projects or little one person projects, right? But even then, if they're doing it in a state... Yeah, if they're doing it in a state like California, where in a lot of cases you're not working under any sort of agency, but California's environmental laws, CEQA, it requires that you do these sorts of cultural resources surveys. But then again, where do they go, right? Where does the information go? It's supposed to go to the information center, but does it? Who's mandating that, right? It's not going to any sort of federal agency in a lot of cases. It's just something that the development company has to get done, so you can write them a report. So when they file for a permit or something, it says, hey, did you get this done? And they say, yes, we got this done. Here's our evidence of that.
Yeah,
but that's
checking.
Exactly. It's not really going anywhere. And so while I'm not trying to throw shade on the little guys, because I am a little guy, it's real easy to not do things that cost you more money, right? Because your margins are so small to begin with. And I feel like the people that do acknowledge their shortcomings, so to speak, and are willing to see the value in paying for that, because a lot of people can't see the value in doing that either. Like, for example, you're doing some work for somebody that they either can't do it quickly themselves or don't have the time for it. And I've done the exact same thing. I've hired out my GIS work before, even though I have enough of an understanding of most GIS programs. I was just using QGIS because I didn't, have the $6,000 to $8,000 Esri license with my small company, and I didn't need it. QGIS was just fine enough. But I have enough knowledge to sit there and do my own maps and sketch maps and put stuff together. But I can also get this stuff done in a fraction of the time, which ultimately saves me money by having somebody else who knows what they're doing do it. If I can just send them the data and they send me back maps, right? They send me back everything that I need to do this. And it's the same thing with some of these data collection practices and trying to figure out what we're going to do. Another quote that we pulled out here was hire professionals and get real about the real costs. But realistically, if you think about it, if you're doing it in the quote right way, then it should actually cost you less. I don't know how many times I've had that argument with people when, trying to sell WildNote when I was doing that, and tap forms before that, and any sort of digital codify, any sort of digital solution. It was like, yeah, sure, this has a cost to it, but it's going to save you money because here's a framework for you that's already built in for you to go and record data, and you don't have to think about it, and we'll maintain it for you, right? We'll maintain that code base and make sure it's always good. But here, you go collect data using this. And a lot of business owners have a hard time seeing that upfront cost as a back-end savings. And that's probably where a lot of this lies.
Well, and then touching on that, and also what you were just saying about costs in slightly different capacities, and back to the thing about mandates, is if you know what you're supposed to do and you build that cost into your proposal and some other guy doesn't because they know they can get the job by not doing it.
Yeah, you just lost your project.
You've just lost the job. And just, if it's mandated that things get treated in certain ways, then, the data get treated in certain ways and deposited in certain formats in certain places, then it's a level playing field. Let me just put it that way. So that's where the mandates really become critical to this, So again, if it can be mandated so that nobody, lowballs, and then can be easy enough that even people who aren't under the mandate for whatever reason still do it because it makes more sense. It's cheaper for them in the long run, like the hiring the professional. Great. Then we start to ease our way out of the crisis.
Right. All right. Well, let's ease our way out of this section and see what we can say about this on the other side. Back in a minute. Welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 215, talking about the data curation issue, crisis, something or other. And we'll go from there. And, just looking at some of the remaining data points that we have left, Paul, I did want to bring this up, and I see you've reordered these in an order that I was going to just talk about them, because I totally buy this. Because one of the things that was also mentioned in one of these articles was poor data backup practices. And I guess one of the surveys they did said 2/3 of respondents said they have lost data. And I feel like that just goes back to how many people do you hear in this business that are business owners, they're field techs, they're crew chiefs, they're project managers, whatever. And they say, oh, technology hates me. I don't understand technology. It's just like, then why are you here? Because this is now a technological field. And if you don't understand that kind of stuff, you're doing more damage than good, I feel like. I'm sure you hear that all the time.
I hear that all the time. It's always frustrated me. Part of me does get a sense of like animism around certain tech. Like I think that printers are just inherently evil creatures that exist for no other reason than to do something really bad to you at the most inconvenient moment. And so you can't get that paper turned in or the, whatever.
Yeah. PC load letter. What does that mean?
And I do see people. I do see people that seem to just be cursed with tech, and other people like me that seem to just be blessed.
Sure.
I've always said that, computers are afraid of me because they know what I do to them when they're when they misbehave too much. I will gladly just gut them and use their parts.
Nice.
But that's also, hyperbole and kind of goofy joking around. But yeah, back to your point is that, yeah, we are in a tech industry, and I realize nobody has to like tech. You certainly don't have to like all tech. I don't like all tech. There's certain things that just annoy the hell out of me, but you have to not be afraid of it anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so when I'm training people, that's one of the big things. It's like, yes, I know you don't get, GIS, you don't get photogrammetry. But you know what? It's mostly push button right now. What you can get is following a recipe, and you're going to get good results at the end of it. Good enough for our purposes at the moment, And then, a little hand holding, a little explanation, a little, guidance and teaching. And most people actually do end up figuring out what they need to do with that tech. It's just that, people get thrown into problems that are multivariate without a good sense of where to start solving the problem. Oh no, I can't get the GPS working with the iPad working with the software I've got on it. Where's the problem?
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, let's start at the beginning and work our way through. Is the GPS working? Yes. How do we know? Is it getting its corrections? Yes. How do we know? Is it talking to the iPad properly? Yes, it looks like it is. Okay, is it talking to the software? That's where the problem is, but if you're just thrown in GPS, no worky, and you don't have that sense of how to solve the problem, it becomes very frightening. And I think that, to tie it back to the discussion of the data curation crisis, I think that's where a lot of things are. I mean, one of the points that was brought up was that people need to be trained specifically in data collection and storage. They need to, have a sense of how you curate information from an excavation and from research in a way that's usable and has longevity and can be findable by other people and such. And if you're not trained in that, it just becomes this magic box of problems that you have to solve, and you don't know where to get a toehold on. So maybe that's something that has to start being trained, and it probably is in certain places, but being trained in the regular archaeological I almost said postdoctorate. No, it's got to be done well before that in the archaeological education for your undergrads and so on, and baked into our training all along. And it's stuff that's going to change. But if you don't know how to even begin working on it, how to even begin asking the right questions, you're never ever going to come up with the right answers. And that probably goes a long ways to explaining why so many people reported having lost data. Yeah,
and another point that was pulled out of this issue too kind of relates to all that, because people always do an archaeology project, and one of the, if you're doing the write-up and analysis of the recorded information, and you're putting together the report or, whatever was put together as a result of this, one of the sections that you're excited as an academic to do is the analysis section, and just kind of figure out, what does this all mean? How does this fit into the greater context of things? That's like the biggest thing that we all want to, and we want to understand it. We want to know how to do it, and we want to know where these things are. That's why we do archaeology. So that's just like ingrained in our brains. Where does this all fit, and how does this fit? But one of the things that was pointed out in the issue was that people don't generally look for existing collections that their data set might fit into in order to actually collect it in the same way that it would just kind of plug into this data set. And then you could have a larger data set about the same topic. That's common in, say, like BLM industries and BLM offices in like Nevada, Utah, things like that, where you do have to kind of fit it into something else. They do have some fairly rigorous standards, but there's definitely a lot of places in the country that do not have that. And it's up to the researchers to go find, hey, how does this fit with the bigger picture, and how do I collect my data to make that more understandable?
And I'm going to pivot a little bit too. One of the other points that came as a bit of a shock was that, and it's obvious now that I think about it, but we're cramming a lot of different kinds of data curation into the same sorts of institutions, right? So a museum, for example, would get the artifacts from, think 50 plus years ago, that generating a lot of artifacts.
Yeah.
They'd be getting the artifacts, and they'd also be getting field notebooks and the dig cards and whatever else was going on with that project. And those all get housed in the same place because they're all part of the same project. And then as things transition to electronic media, whether they're born digital or whether they're scans of, even these old 50 plus year old cards, the responsibility for doing that and the responsibility for holding on to that stays in the same place. So a place that's made to, and has expertise in maintaining physical artifacts and data is now having to also take on the task of maintaining digital data, which is a totally different workflow. It's a totally different set of expectations and obligations.
Yeah.
And I don't know I don't know a lot, but I don't know with this case what the right answer is. But to see it spelled out like that, I saw it, I was like, oh, yeah, why is that? Well, it is that because it's historical, but is that the way it has to be? I don't know. Maybe because I can see the value in having the data from a project, whether it's artifacts all the way through to the digital records that were born digital, all be in the same, under the same umbrella, the same institution. But that's not necessarily the best way to do it because the needs, again, are totally different. So, this whole issue, again, is just a lot of food for thought and a lot of things that I just wanted to chat with you about, Chris, because I don't have any answers at all. And I just like to work my brain through these questions. And again, it does matter to me, particularly with the work that I'm doing in Lagash, where we are generating data and we're early enough in the project. We've got a few seasons under our belt, but it's at a point that we can regularize and standardize everything so that our field workflow all the way through publication all talk to each other in a good way. And we meet the obligations that certain funding groups like the NSF have placed on us. And maybe that's the regulation thing again. Yeah. On making these accessible to other people, not just to ourselves.
And that's huge, right? I've always said that 50% of our job as archaeologists is actually the excavation and report writing phase, where you think that might be 100% of it. No, that's really 50% because the other half is telling people about it. If you don't tell people about it in some way, shape, or form, then what was the point of everything you just did, right? And even if those people are other academics at conferences and you're just, you're adding to the dialogue, sure, that's minimum viable product, I would say. But at the very least, do that, right? But so many projects just end up in a file cabinet somewhere. They call it the gray literature for a reason, because it's sitting in gray government file cabinets. That's why it's called that, and nobody knows it's there.
Yeah, and it's why that final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of rings true, right? With the Ark just going into this humongous warehouse full of other crates. And yes, it wasn't obviously. Indiana Jones is not an accurate representation of archaeology as it's ever been done, but somehow that big bureaucracy, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a bureaucracy. It could just be, archaeologist, legitimate archaeologist that just doesn't think of processing their data in a way that's, and, making it available to anybody else. And so they sit in that professor's file cabinet. Or maybe it's done a little more above the board and it sits in that, I don't know, in the county courthouse or someplace. Just disappears.
Well, I think that scene in Indiana Jones is probably the most accurate scene in all the Indiana Jones movies. But in some way, I feel like that just rings true with a lot of different things. But back to your point too about, how we don't really have any answers. That's one of the things I like about doing podcasts too, is because I'm hoping somebody listening to this, somebody listening to this probably does have an answer, right? They just never really thought about it too clearly, perhaps, or maybe they didn't realize that what they had bouncing around their head actually is the answer, and they didn't think to tell anybody about it, right? So, I mean, definitely bring this stuff up. Go to conferences where these kinds of things are being discussed. Talk to TDAR, talk to Open Context, and start making a difference with this stuff. If you've got a good idea,
read what AHS has published. Because that's accessible. It's been there for years and it's heavily used, not in the US.
Well, yeah. So that's another thing too. All the answers are not here necessarily, right? Somebody somewhere else, may have already figured this out. Are we even talking to them? The UK is one place where we might have some collaboration there because they're just a little more closer culturally, I guess, to us, if we're going to say that. I don't even know if that's the right word for it, but we seem to have a lot more affiliation and people go there for, degrees and things like that. But there's plenty of other countries in this world and plenty of other people from those countries listening to these podcasts that would probably say, what are you guys talking about? Is this really a problem in the United States? Because we figured it out. Here it is, and I'd love to see like smaller countries in Europe. I'm sure they've got a relatively easier time at something like this if they have figured it out because of the smaller landmass. Let's just be honest, right? There's probably one region or something like that they're dealing with versus the United States, which has many different regions, all the different states. But I'd like to see how a country like China deals with an issue like this, or a country like Russia, something like that. First off, what kind of CRM programs do they even have? Is it all academic? Do they have CRM, that kind of thing? And then how are countries that have a little more heavy hand from a government to public standpoint, how are they dealing with this? Is there a mandate? And is it working, right? Is there a mandated data standard? And is that actually working for them in that particular context? I don't know. I'd be really interested to find that out.
Yeah. That's for other people other than me who are really, really into this. I'm only, I don't say peripherally, but it's not the central part of my focus of my work.
Yeah.
It's something that regardless of whether it's not central to your work, it has to be part of your work. Yeah. And you could argue that it has to be a central part, but maybe not the research like what you're suggesting, but certainly the solutions, even if they're incomplete, even if they're not great, an attempt at them has to be part of everybody's work.
Sure.
Why don't we just round this out right now, Chris, because we've asked a lot of questions and we've brought up a lot of problems, and I don't think we have any real solutions other than things might get better if things get better. And I still
think that's
have
the
a
theme
bunch
of this
of
podcast.
check boxes. Yeah, I think I've got a bunch of check boxes here that I still haven't brought up of things that kind of slightly blew my mind as I was reading this. But that can be saved for another day because this very topic is going to come up again. And hopefully it comes up again with an interview with somebody who's figured it out, who's cracked the nut. But even if it doesn't, and I'm not holding my breath for that, I'm not a gambling man and I wouldn't put money on that we're going to talk about the same topic before too long again.
Indeed. And if anybody listening to this does have any ideas or things they might want to bring onto the show, because again, people who may have some sort of way to handle this and a way to actually get some things done, may be listening to the show, but don't actually have any answers, and they could use some help in the brainstorming area. So if you want to talk about it, you got some ideas, send us an email. Maybe we'll talk about it on the show. Maybe we'll bring you on the show.
Yeah.
And see how that goes. Yeah. So, there was a whole special issue that we're talking about that kicked off a 2-episode discussion. So there's definitely people talking about this and people concerned with this issue. We just haven't quite gotten there yet as far as what the real solution is. So, all right. Well, anything else to add, Paul?
No, I'm going to go outside and enjoy the rest of this beautiful day while I can. And I hope you do the same, though I think it's raining where you're at right now.
It's actually sunny now because it's Oregon. So, yeah, it was raining when we started.
Wait a minute.
I know. Now it's sunny. Yeah. So anyway. All right. Well, thanks for that, Paul. This is a good discussion. Again, if you want to contact us, Chris at Archaeology Podcast Network for my email address. Other contact information is in the show notes. Please go check that out. And you can just leave a comment on this episode wherever you found it or at arcpodnet.com/archaeotech.
Yeah. I'm going to say one more thing before we go. And if you are a member of the APN, hop on the Discord, ask us questions there. Because we do have discussions going on there about this topic and others.
And here's a little secret too. So far, the Discord is actually not for members only right now. So if you want to join the Discord, we got rid of our Slack team, which was for members only. In fact, it's still live. We haven't actually dumped it yet, but now we have this Discord channel, and you can get that through our newsletter. So if you go to arcpodnet.com and just scroll the page for a little bit, you'll see a little pop-up, and that is an invitation to subscribe to our newsletter. And every Friday that comes out, and there's actually a link to the Discord right in front there. We haven't put it anywhere online yet because we were really just transitioning members over, but we've had a discussion about it, and it's going to be, we're going to have member features within the Discord server, but the general channels themselves are not members only anymore. So, but there are going to be some sections that are. So we're still kind of working that out. But anyway, yeah, join the conversation over there. Thanks for bringing that up, Paul. And we will hopefully see you there. With that, I think we'll pause on this one and contemplate and maybe talk about it later at some point in the future.
Certainly talk about it later.
Indeed. With that, we'll see you next time. Paul, thanks for joining, and go have a good barbecue.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Take care.
All right, bye.
Thanks for listening to the Archaeotech podcast. Links to items mentioned on the show are in the show notes at www.arcpodnet.com/archaeotech. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com and paul@lugal.com. Support the show by becoming a member at arcpodnet.com/members. The music is a song called Off Road and is license free from Apple. Thanks for listening.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.